down immediately remind you of the Terminator. The Terminator, a cultural icon starting from the 80s, and it's something that has been parodied and referenced constantly throughout popular media. You'd think then that the Terminator would be one of the highest grossing franchises of all time. Who doesn't know who the Terminator is? Well, it's entirely possible that more people might know who the Minions are as opposed to the Terminator. The Terminator is nowhere even close to being one of the highest grossing franchises of all time. While certainly one of the most remembered parts of the 80s, it's something that throughout the years has essentially messed with itself so hard that it's ended up now becoming an absolute parody of itself, both on accident and also on purpose. The muddied up waters of the franchise of the Terminator have turned what could have been a promising, amazing franchise, or at the very least, 2 fantastic movies, into what is now 6 just kinda movies. With a lineage worse than the Habsburgs, look it up, the Terminator franchise has really become this strange mutant version of what it used to be. Hello everyone, I am the Movie-a-thoner. I of course talk about all kinds of movie franchises in order to see what exactly happened to them over time, starting with the beginning and ending with the most recent whatever nonsense we have in modern times. Today we're talking about the Terminator franchise. The original Terminator, starting all the way in 1984, is something that's honestly special to me, right? I watched it all of the time, and I'm not talking T2, I'm talking the original Terminator was the one that we had on DVD. Same with the second one, obviously. Both of them were watched a multitude of times, but for some reason the first one drew me in more, probably because it was more of a thriller horror type movie, and rewatching it and T2 so many times is what made me love this character and this series. But oddly enough, my first exposure was with T3, Rise of the Machines, right? I really enjoy what the Terminator is as a series, at least I used to, right? Right when I was getting more of film critic-y is when Genysis came out, and that's when I really began to look into the franchise, look back at T3 to really see what it really was, and then to finally actually see Salvation, a movie that I could have seen 1,000 times considering it was always on FX, the movie they had, and then finally see Salvation, a movie I could have seen honestly 1,000 times because it was always on FX, but just never got around to finally making my initial Terminator videos several years ago, and it was around the time when Genysis had been a few years old, but before we got the announcement of Dark Fate, when I made my initial Terminator videos, right? And when Dark Fate came out, I of course saw it, and I hated it. I hate Genysis, I'm not a big fan of Salvation, and 3 has certainly not aged well, and that's kind of the general opinion for most people involving the Terminator, is that over time, it's just gotten worse. And I used to think that, certain movies were better than others, and it certainly hasn't went a full spiral downwards, but no, every movie just is worse than the last, pretty much. I have, of course, a lot to say about it, and also I really want to talk about the interesting story that is why exactly the Terminator franchise is so messed up as it is. So without further ado, let's talk about the Terminator. All the way back in 1982, when James Cameron was helping make Piranha 2: The Spawning, the sequel to the Piranha movie, which is essentially one of many Jaws ripoff films, alongside friend William Wisher Jr., who received an additional dialogue credit for this movie. The two of them worked together on a script based on a weird food poisoning idea that he had one night, which of course was going to be about a big man in sunglasses who of course was a robot. Inspired by certain slasher films like Halloween, he wanted to make a lower budget horror suspense movie which ultimately would work well with this sort of character. Cameron's agent really hated the concept, and that's ultimately why Cameron decided to fire his agent. He then began working with Gale Ann Hurd, a very important figure in the story of the Terminator franchise. He had previously worked with. She is, of course, well known for being a producer of various well-doing movies, and working with her would certainly result in the success of the movie. Cameron would sell the rights to this series to Hurd in order that she would help make the film, and that Cameron would direct it. Soon enough, they would work with Orion Pictures, who would agree to distribute, but only if Cameron would get the backing elsewhere, with them also not being sure about the idea. Thankfully, John Daly, chairman and president of the Helmsdale Film Corporation, picked up the movie, and they were able to get enough funding in order to get this movie started. Orion, though they decided to not have any monetary investment in this, did of course attempt to get the main role, that of course being of Kyle Reese, who would fight the Terminator off. They decided that it was going to be hopefully someone much more famous, like Sylvester Stallone or Mel Gibson. Man, Sylvester Stallone in a Terminator film sounds like a weird idea. Orion co-founder Mike Minovoy suggested O.J. Simpson, but at that time, Cameron, quote, did not believe that O.J. would be believable as a killer. Ultimately, this suggestion was then open to up-and-coming actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who ultimately was one that Cameron was not really okay with. He devised a plan to meet up with him, start a fight with him, and use it as an excuse. But for some reason, the guy was just so likable that he decided that he needed to cast him. He also saw his absolutely imposing figure and then probably went, A, I really shouldn't fight this man, and B, oh my god, he'd look great as my main villain. Now, at this time, there was a little bit of problem with filming because also at this time, Arnold was off doing, Conan. And Arnold was essentially just kind of taking this because he felt like he might as well. He was honestly not very interested in the film. He even has been quoted with saying, oh, just some shit movie I'm doing. But he decided that a more contemporary film would be a change of pace, mostly due to, the fact that he had been recently casted as a bunch of big fantasy dudes. As Arnold wouldn't be Reese, it would then go to certain other actors to be Reese. People were thinking Sting, which, man, Sting in an action film would be weird, wouldn't it? Some other ideas were Christopher Reeve, Matt Dillon, Kurt Russell, Tommy Lee Jones. Ultimately, Michael Biehn was chosen due to the fact that he had recently seen Taxi Driver. Biehn had bigger aspirations of being like other actors that he was inspired by, like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and honestly didn't want to take the film, also feeling like it was just some weird, silly sci-fi film. Even in the 80s, people really didn't have respect for sci-fi. Several actresses were considered for Sarah Connor, the other main figure, but it ultimately went to Linda Hamilton, who had just finished filming Children of the Corn. The film's special effects, mixed with miniatures and stop motion, were created by a mix of Stan Winston, who of course mostly did the stop motion stuff, and Gene Warren Jr., who ran Fantasy 2 and did all the scenes for the cool-ass future bit, which the whole movie starts with. The soundtrack composed and performed on synthesizer by Brad Fiedel really adds to the feel of it and really brings everything together. And despite all the misgivings of this movie, this honestly shot in the dark, all of it comes together to be an incredibly enjoyable film. Of course, if you don't already know, The Terminator is about a robotic man who's been given synthetic skin to look like Arnold in order to be sent from the future to 1984 LA, ultimately in order to kill Sarah Connor. After killing Sarah Connor, the Terminator then goes, oops, wrong Sarah Connor. Kyle Reese is also sent from the future, being fully naked because apparently clothes aren't time travelable, where ultimately Reese finds the real Sarah Connor right at the right time in order to save her from the Terminator, who begins shooting up stuff in a nightclub. After stealing a police car and taking her away, Sarah is immediately concerned by this crazy man who is telling her that in the future, her son will ultimately fight against big robots. Now, after escaping the Terminator, they're found by the cops who quickly track them down from the stolen police car and even try to interrogate Kyle Reese. And there's this great scene where he's telling them everything, and they're like, "This guy is absolutely crazy." And after fixing himself in a incredibly cool scene, mostly for the 80s, that has aged not all that well with its special effects, but at the very least were, an incredible job in the 80s of replicate Arnold's face, which of course will be done a multitude of times throughout his career. Where soon afterwards, he then, he goes in, tries to speak with Sarah Connor, and then isn't allowed to. Obviously, the man politely leaves and certainly does not come back. Sarah and Kyle escape, and the two ultimately decide to try and run from the Terminator, though Kyle is fully on board with just running again and again and again with the idea that they just kind of can't defeat him right now. It's the fact that he went on a whole rampage, and also the fact that Kyle had a little picture of Sarah, which is enough to finally convince her. It's crazy that even from all the way to the point of the midpoint of the movie, Sarah, is not on board with the whole adventure, but then finally does. This is enough to finally turn her on, as the two then get it on. Could you imagine being in a situation where some guy runs up to you and tells you your future son will fight robots in the future, and your first thought is, this guy's crazy, but he's kinda hot. Soon enough, we get to our last little action scene, the last really cool chase scene where they shoot off the Terminator, ultimately resulting in him hijacking a truck and then flipping it over and it exploding using a friggin' pipe bomb. You'd think that'd be it, right? Because he's just a robot man, right? But he is also a robot, so of course he survives. The Terminator coming out being, removed of skin is an awesome shot, though ultimately him walking towards them, can be done a little bit better. Ultimately, they go to the big Cyberdyne-owned factory where they begin fighting him throughout it. It really feels like a horror film here, This is really where it goes into horror thriller as it chases down the two, ending up killing Kyle, resulting in Sarah Connor being the one to kill off the Terminator, finally bringing him to a little hydraulic press and squishing him. Ending the movie with Sarah Connor, now pregnant, doing her little audio logs in order to be like, you're gonna save the future, John. I sure hope you get to know Kyle Reese. He's a cool boy. Take care of Kyle Reese. No reason given, I promise. The movie ends kind of hopefully, right? In the fact that in the future, her son will defend the world. And that's all it really needed to be. The Terminator really didn't need a sequel when you really consider it. It ends pretty definitively, right? My son is going to save the world at the end. I've defeated the robot. It wasn't made with the idea of a sequel, but it's cool that it got one at all. It took a while, though, for various reasons. Orion Pictures did not have faith in the Terminator performing well at all and feared negative reception. Weird that that's like a thing at all. But ultimately, the actors were like, no, release it further, because I'm sure at that point, by the making of the movie, they went, this is really good. So finally, after having a much wider release, it was #1 at the box office for 2 whole weeks before being taken up by Oh God, You Devil, the third in a boring film series of which I will never speak on in this channel ever. So oddly at the time, it had very mixed reception. Certainly there are people that really enjoyed it. The original Terminator is a fantastic film. Now, it's a simple movie, right? I didn't have too much to really explain about, Arnold chases Sarah, right? So there's that. But the movie itself has just this great vibe to it, The fact that it has this synth soundtrack, it is this movie that's both incredibly suspenseful, but also very, comfortable. I really enjoy this movie. It's just fun to watch it. It's fun to see this big square-jawed man just slowly chase these guys as they go through this noir feeling, dingy city, and they deal with this prospect of this future war against robots. It's such a cool concept. It's so awesome. What do you want me to say? It's able to really bring it all together so incredibly well that it results in it being this world that, despite just being in modern times, is a film that has so much for it in terms of world building, thanks to the idea of a future war against robots. I enjoy good pacing. That's because of movies like this that do a really good job building its characters and allowing you to more realistically have them understand what's going on and hop onto it at the point. So you have a character who again, for a chunk of the film, does not believe what's going on, but she is in the middle of a bunch of cool action scenes that happen to be from Future War, so you don't really care that she isn't fully on board with it yet. And the relationship between her and Kyle Reese obviously isn't the greatest written relationship of all time. It is at least one that you do find entertaining. You like these two together. They have a lot of chemistry on screen together, despite, them kind of just only recently meeting. And you can kind of see why she would want to get with the guy. He's kind of hot. But then again, so was Arnold. Have you seen how jacked he was at the time? That was what he did. He was a big guy. And yeah, he was so understandable as a menacing figure. When this man walks up to you, you gotta be ready, dude. You gotta be ready. It's an incredibly well-written film too. There's not a lot of parts of it that feel like it was meant to be some cheesy 80s movie. This was written to be a serious action suspense film, and you really do feel that, right? There are moments that it certainly can be a little bit like that, but that's only because of retrospect of things being certain ways, but it just feels so right, you know? Like all of it just feels like it comes together so well. You know, there's so many great lines that just came out so naturally. That didn't feel like forced in any way of like, this is our line. One-liner, you know? Like, it's early 80s. This is before it really got wacky, you know? And it's so fun and entertaining of a film to go back to. When you go into this film, you're probably not expecting it to be like more like a horror film, you know? But since I've kind of grown up with the movie, I understand what Terminator is trying to be. And as like a more horror-esque film, it really does a good job in the same way of what, like, you know, Halloween does, of this slow build-up to this guy getting to them, and you see this menacing, imposing figure slowly encroach upon them as he has a big-ass gun ultimately blowing up things, and you're like, oh my god, what's gonna stop this man? Probably nothing. The Terminator is one of my favorite films of all time, just straight up. I love this movie. I'm not a guy who likes rewatching movies, but I will so rewatch The Terminator any moment someone asks me to. If they're like, you want to watch The Terminator? I'll be like, which of the two? Which of the two that matter? I'm down. Beautiful, intimate cinematography, this great noir feel, this fantastic soundtrack, fantastic acting. The original Terminator is amazing. And if you haven't already seen it, what are you doing? Watch The Terminator. The Terminator won 3 Saturn Awards for Best Science Fiction Film, Best Makeup, and Best Writing. And among various other awards, The Terminator has been recognized as one of the best, right? One of the most iconic films of all time, and rightfully so. Despite not getting a sequel till 1999, The Terminator got a whole bunch of different merchandise because, of course, it was the 80s. Any action film ultimately got something based on it. Rambo got a cartoon. That's still a thing. In 88 Now Comics got a whole series of comics that basically takes place a little bit afterwards and is in the far future, involving a group called Sarah's Slammers, which is awesome, by the way. And a couple years before the original Terminator, there's almost like a whole plan to go and defeat Skynet. Also, a multitude of games based on the first Terminator, on the NES, on the Genysis, one on the DOS, which is crazy. People were certainly into the Terminator, so it's a wonder that it took as long as it did to finally have a sequel. Mind you, at the time, sequels didn't immediately pop out, right? It was more like a, should we? Yeah, and that's kind of what happened with T2. But the Terminator was a significant success. It made Arnold's career. My guy became the biggest guy ever, and it especially went for Linda Hamilton as well. The only reason that sequel stalled for as long as it did is because of the Hemdell Film Corporation. Hell, its founder attempted to alter the ending of The Terminator. And unfortunately, they couldn't make another movie because, you know, Cameron had surrendered 50% of his rights to them in order to get The Terminator made at all. And in the years intervening, the rest of them were sold to Gail Ann Hurd, as we know, not just in terms of the ones that she already had, but the rest of what remained went to her after they got a divorce. Yes, in between Terminators, he married and divorced the very producer who helped make the first Terminator film. Thus, she owned the rest of the rights to the series. In 1990, Arnold and Cameron decided to get Cargo Pictures to hopefully buy all of the film rights from both of the owners of Terminator. And ultimately, throughout the year, they would spend so much money, man. So much money. $10 million for Hemdell's share, $5 million to Hurd, among other costs, resulting in it being $17 million in order to get the rights to the Terminator. So everything was bowing down on whatever would come next for this franchise to do incredibly well. Cargo Pictures owner Mario Kassar ultimately told Cameron that in order to recoup on this investment, the film would proceed with or without him, and offered Cameron $6 million to be involved and write the script. The release date was scheduled, and thus Cameron had 6 to 7 weeks to write the sequel. And he, of course, asked William Wisher himself in order to spend like 2 whole weeks in order to figure out what was going on and what they were going to do. Their ideas was, of course, to bring in a good Terminator in order to change up what exactly they had to do for the next movie. The whole thing diverged from science fiction slasher, and very similar to what would happen with the Alien to Aliens change, which of course was also thanks to Cameron, it was going to be more of an action film. While they originally thought of a super Terminator, the idea of a Terminator which was gonna go up against Arnold's Terminator came from one of the initial ideas of the original film, which of course was a liquid metal Terminator. It being the 90s, the effect was a little bit better, and they were gonna try to do it again. They decided to work with ILM in order to figure out if it was even possible. Cameron was brought back, Arnold was brought back, but they almost brought in Billy Idol to be the T-1000, and thank God they didn't. That would have been weird. So they decided to go to Robert Patrick, who at this point was 31 and living in his car. He was one of several actors in their late 20s considered for the role, and just due to the fact that he looked so intense, he was picked for the role. He drew inspiration from Arnold's performance from the first film, and did a very good job sort of being the comeback of this serious robotic feeling monster in order to go up against the little bit more warmer feeling Arnold, who at this point was a little bit more of a household name. He'd been in a little bit more movies since, and while he hadn't been in the comedy films yet, note for future just in case I'm wrong, Edward Furlong was of course chosen to be the finally physically appearing John Connor, who at this point was chosen just due to the fact that he seemed just like a punk kid. Oddly, he had no acting experience and wasn't even one of the kids that came for auditions. Imagine going to an audition and going, one of us is gonna get this role, and then being wrong. It's notable that due to the kind of rushed production, that this movie was filmed incredibly out of order. A lot of what happens in it was specifically made in the way that it was in order for it to be made at all. They really prioritized actually making the scenes with the special effects before ever really actually making the dialogue stuff. One of the first scenes ever filmed was the part with the crazy-ass truck. With a $60 million budget alongside the already $17 million budget, this was an incredibly expensive film, and the greater scope of the sequel was a daunting prospect. And this was one of those kind of films that wasn't very easy to film. A lot of people that were on it really didn't like working with Cameron due to this film, and Cameron, a very professional man, was not an easy director to work with. The crew apparently made t-shirts that had the slogan, "You can't scare me, I worked for Jim Cameron," which is insane. Arnold, being, the good friend that he is, tries his hardest to ultimately bring a more positive look to it, but if you're asking anyone else, it was not fun to film this movie. In fact, there was a lot filmed for this movie, and a bunch were, completely deleted, and this movie was probably saved in its edit, and the initial ending, which would have shown, a years later grown-up John Connor just, having a more peaceful life with a old Sarah Connor, was honestly a really good idea, and I really liked that scene. It probably should have been the actual conclusion, but it sure wasn't. 4 separate companies were involved in creating the 150 visual effects scenes, and yeah, oh my god, it really worked out. There was a lot of effort put into this in order for it to look absolutely fantastic. Thing is though, the T-1000 isn't just fully CGI. There are parts in the actual movie itself that they mix the CGI with actual practical appliances, and they do a lot to really hide CGI. All this coming together into T2 ended up thankfully making a fantastic sequel. T2 Judgment Day, releasing on July 3rd, 1991, ultimately was an incredible hit. My god, they certainly did recoup the cost, not only in terms of the budget, but also them, buying the rights. So yeah, it worked out for everybody. Considered one of the best science fiction action and sequels ever made, T2 is an absolute banger of a movie. We're back in the future, and the future is still being ravaged by giant robots. Skynet goes, oops, that other one didn't work, and sends the T-1000, again a liquid metal prototype Terminator. Ultimately, it is sent to kill It is sent to kill John Connor when he is still young and is not ready to fight a whole Terminator. But thankfully, in the future John sends the T-800 in order to save himself. John's a bit of a punk kid due to the fact that his mom has continued to get in trouble because she's kind of raised him like a little bit of a whack job. I mean, she needs to prepare him for a future of friggin' skeleton robots. So John does not like her and is living with foster parents, but ultimately it is after being a goofball and going to the arcade instead of studying, is when he's attacked by the T-1000. Soon he is of course saved by Arnold and his box of flowers, except it's a gun, which of course saves him. And though John is pretty freaked out, especially after they get into a crazy motorcycle truck chase, they ultimately go to find Sarah and bring her along for the ride. Sarah really doesn't like the fact that this guy who is now saving her son looks like the man who tried to kill her a while ago. They go to the Cyberdyne engineer, Miles Dyson's house, in order to... The probably kill him. Miles Dyson, who of course is played by Joe Morton, ultimately stayed off away from a good majority of the cast in order to make it, seem more realistic that they weren't his friend and that they were essentially ready to absolutely kill the man. However, Miles is able to save his life by him going, "We can just shut the whole thing down, don't kill me." Now you might wonder, why is Sarah so ready to kill John? Well, she did just have a whole nightmare about the nuclear holocaust, so yeah. But they decide to sneak into Cyberdyne Industries and try to shut down the CPU, which will inevitably result in, Skynet. But the police, mostly thanks to the T-1000s, go and attack the building. You have the awesome shootout that results in this, and ultimately Dyson, who gets shot in the process, goes, "Leave, I'm going to explode." Blows up the whole building, and you'd think that's it, but ultimately they still have to get the T-1000 off their ass. They go into the steel mill, and you get the awesome steel mill fight scene of them fighting off the guy, eventually resulting in him getting blown to shit and then shoved into the lava? Molten? What is this? But the T-800 decides the only way to fully get rid of Skynet is to make sure that no part of them could possibly be reused by some kind of government or some kind of army man in the future, and goes down with the T-1000 into the molten metal with the awesome thumbs up gesture. Sarah and John, now with a renewed hope for the future, leave in order for them to hopefully live a much better life. And again, had they had the alternate ending, this would have been a, open shut case of this is the end of the series, and God knows everyone involved was perfectly fine with that concept. The next sequel would take all the way till 2003 to make, and that would be both because some people weren't really interested in ever making the thing, but for other reasons we'll get to. So, if it isn't clear, Terminator 2 is an absolute banger of a movie, and if you haven't already seen it, go see it. Oh my god! What are you doing? What? Why haven't you seen T2 Judgment Day? What are you doing? Stop what you're doing and watch T2 Judgment Day. My god, what are you doing? T2 Judgment Day is everything that the first Terminator was, but even better. Due to the fact that it is more of an action film, it has a different feel to it, but it has a reminder feel, It still has that cool synth soundtrack, it still has this monster of a man in Arnold absolutely wrecking things, but now he's on our side, and it's that very feel itself of the old villain is now helping us fight the new villain is what I've always felt like the right way to build a new villain. You know how dangerous the other guy can be, so now you can see what this guy can do. The fact that he's all these crazy liquid metal stuff is absolutely amazing, and effects-wise, it works so incredibly well. Maybe, you look at it years later, and like the first one, there are parts that you're like, well, that's a little bit weird, but you don't give a shit. It's awesome, and that's all I care about. They put so much effort into making this movie look so cool and just do so well that, like, by the time you're like, man, this stretch of road is so incredibly long, it's already moved past it. The cinematography is incredibly great, it's intense and fast, and it just works so incredibly well with the feel of this movie of constant action over and over and over, but in such a way that it doesn't, like, get rid of what works about the original. The original has some great character work, and the fact that it was so intimate and close up, and the fact that it really worked with the fact that you cared about the actual main character. And this continues. Linda Hamilton does so incredibly well as Sarah Connor, and she's still the same character. You can tell why she's so messed up about the original. You understand from what she went through why she's doing what she's doing. And T2 does a great job building from the initial movie. The great scenes of a horrifying guy with a cool synth soundtrack are now for Robert Patrick in the T-1000, and the cool action star whole feel of Arnold works so incredibly well with this, and the two going up against each other is like seeing Godzilla and King Kong fight. You're like, let's go, come on! It's just constant awesome the whole way through. There is not a single part of this movie that I have a problem with, Yeah, looking back at it, like I said, some parts may not work exactly as well, but it's a movie that's aged so incredibly well with its action and its cinematography and its acting and its writing especially. It goes a little bit more into cheesy late 80s stuff because it's still the beginning of the 90s, so it's got a little bit of that feel, but it melds so well together with these characters that these more comedic moments work well, You don't have the Terminator being a goofball. You have him as the Terminator. He's still the guy he was in the first one, but now he's for our side. He isn't trying to kill us. He's trying to kill everybody else. And this intensity of these characters using what was already established works so incredibly well for its well-written character moments. Sarah Connor has an amazing arc, as does John Connor, and you really can tell Like, this is the younger version of the guy he will inevitably be. He may be a punk kid at times, but he is a guy who knows right from wrong. And with like enough training from this, he will be the guy who will save the world. And you feel that in this. And that's why T2 is so cool, because it does everything it can to take what was established in the previous one, and it bumps it up 10 times more. So it's not just a more intense, bigger action film, but it continues in the right way, every way possible of what should be a sequel is what T2 is, right? You can add things, you can change things, but if things were gonna lead to where they were clearly gonna lead as established in the previous one, a sequel needs to go there, and that's what T2 does. It is art, dude. It's one of the best movies ever. It's one of the best movies ever. T2, like the first one, won several awards and has been acknowledged as one of the best and most important movies of all time. T2, if you haven't already seen it, my God, go and see it. Find it. You can find it on friggin' Paramount, I think. That's a thing we'll get to later. The distribution rights are by whole other companies, so they're the ones that decide what streaming service it goes in, regardless of who owns the actual franchise at the moment, so yeah. Mind you, a whole bunch of Terminator media was obviously made from T2, a multitude of games. Like, my God, a lot of games were made for T2. 5 games were made by Bethesda in between T2 and T3. Infogrames in 2002 made Dawn of Fate, which was kind of like a prequel to the initial movie. And Dark Horse, of course, gained the comic rights in the mid-90s and kept making their own crazy future adventures involving Terminators coming into the past to fight other guys and being fought off by cool secret agents from the future. They made stuff both before and after T2, and they kind of wrapped T2 into their own weird Dark Horse lore. If you've read the Alien or Predator comics, you'll know that movies coming out is weird when Dark Horse is making comics, because now they're like, oh, that's very different than what we established. Now we gotta change stuff. But there's a bunch of cool things. There's a couple dumb things, like Death Valley, which is Terminators fighting bikers. It's not as cool as it sounds. And also the first of 2 RoboCop crossovers, because as we know, the Terminator really hates cops. Part of me wants to talk about the RoboCop series, like, in this whole discussion of the Terminator, because there's a little bit of like an attempted connection with the comics, but until they cross over in the movies, which will not happen ever, that's it. Then RoboCop is its own separate video, which I'll probably eventually do in the future. I'd have to rewatch that shows, plural, so, you know, it'll be a bit. By the end of 1995, Carlco had filed for bankruptcy, and Cameron wanted to direct a third film with help of 20th Century Fox. Cameron was able to film the 3D ride Terminator 2 3D Battle Across Time, which would later open in 1996. Bringing in the cast of T2, it's a quite crazy-ass ride. You can find its footage online due to the fact that the ride has ultimately shut down. Opening up in Universal Studios Florida and later Hollywood, both of them went for quite a while. Was replaced in 2013 by The Minions, my God, why? And Hollywood's went all the way till 2020, replaced by...
Jesus Christ, that's Jason Bourne.
Going into the 700-seated theater, they were ultimately shown the T-70 Terminators, as apparently Cyberdyne kept trying to make more Terminators, so ultimately Sarah Connor was like, stop making Terminators! So then, of course, the friggin' T-1000, who you thought was destroyed, shows up, and then is stopped by the T-800, which you also thought was destroyed, but, you know, the continuity isn't important for this theme park ride. They're then brought to the future and they meet the T1 Million, which looks insane. Listen, it's just for a bunch of crazy blowy uppy special effects for you to go, whoa, and then, you know, leave and then go drink some garbage Pepsi, so yeah. But it was meant to be a stepping stone into what was meant to continue this franchise. Though Cameron had no desire to make sequels, at least not fully, he wanted to continue this franchise in some capacity, and that resulted in a big, like, hiatus of the franchise, as Carlco kept trying to figure out a way to sell the rights to this franchise. After their bankruptcy auction in 1995, it was almost bought out by Fox, but Canal Plus bid a lot more than them and bought several parts of Carlco, but not Terminator. Fox was ready to make the film. Hell, Linda Hamilton was also possibly going to return as Sarah Connor, trying to gain all of the rights to the sequel, including some of the ones that Galen Hurd actually still had. She has some hold on the franchise still. I'm incredibly unclear how much, as it did seem Carlco did buy it out. It's probable that it did go after Carlco went to bankruptcy, but I'm unclear about that. Arnold tried to get Cameron to buy the rights to the franchise completely, and had they did that, it would have been probably a lot smoother of a transition for the franchise till where it'll eventually be when Cameron will own the rights to the franchise. Dimension Films, who you may know from several films that may or may not be awful or incredibly cool, depends on the year, tried to buy the rights, but the law was just like, no, you can't, because you weren't even involved in this. You know who was, of course, Andrew G. Vanja. Vajna, who had co-founded Carlco with Mario Kassar, but left the company in '89, decided to team up with him and start their own company to buy Terminator. By '97, they bought the rights to the series, and they began to try and figure out what to do. In '98, they bought Heard's half of the Terminator rights. And by '99, they began negotiating with various studios in order to start the production of this movie. Originally, they wanted to do 2 movies back to back. This is the first of several times we'll note that they wanted to make a Terminator sequel with the prospect of making another Terminator sequel in the future. Whatever for it would have been probably would have been very interesting, but ultimately they decided to go with just T3, Rise of the Machines. Originally, it was going to be John Connor working for just like some garbage computer startup. And even in the beginning, the villain was going to be a female Terminator, as it ended up being, but it would have been the T1G instead of the TX, as it would eventually be. Some early ideas of the Terminator design were in fact later seen in the movie itself as like a little figure. And I actually like this design. I think I like that as like, that's what the Terminators sort of look like in between the 850 and the TX, wherever the TX lies in the line. Which, yes, T850 is ultimately Arnold comes back as not the same robot as he was previously, but now a slightly different model, which is him, but bigger, I guess. It would take through the rest of the 90s and early 2000s for them to finally get everyone involved. The year 2000 is where they figured out the actual director. It was almost going to be Ang Lee, David Fincher, John McTiernan, Ridley Scott, Roland Emmerich. I feel like a lot of times when you hear they were considering these directors, you know that there were no talks. They were just, we're going to write down all the directors that we know, and maybe we'll like ask at least a couple of them, but really we're just going to ask some of the guys who haven't had work in a while. Which, of course, is why they got Jonathan Mostow, who at this point had really only ever made Beverly Hills Body Snatchers and Breakdown. Sure, an action director, and he works well enough, but I feel like he probably wasn't the best pick for this movie. Ted Serafine was hired to write the first draft of the script, and Jonathan Mostow essentially brought his 2 friends from college to rewrite it. They were going to begin in 2001, but ultimately held back when the fact that a writer's strike was almost going to occur. They then began to rewrite a couple of things. The TX was almost China, which would have been awesome, and then also nearly Vin Diesel. That would have been hilarious. But thankfully they got Kristanna Loken, who I think was an absolutely great pick, and they decided to go with a whole different actor for John Connor, going with Nick Stahl as this older, more skittish John Connor. Auditioned 5 times and went through 3 different screen texts before finally receiving the role. They were almost also going to go with Shane West, Jake Gyllenhaal, and even Logan Marshall Green, all of which probably would have been better choices. They didn't go with Furlong due to the fact that in more recent times, despite being a, highly regarded actor and highly wanted actor, he got into some really bad drug problems. And unfortunately, that's kind of the last we ever see of Edward Furlong. Besides being sort of used for at least facial recognition software in Dark Fate later to be like, this is what he vaguely looks like. Furlong doesn't get too much work after this, and that kind of sucks. Featuring more than 600 special effects shots, ILM and Stan Winston Studios came back on to help make this Terminator, and due to that, the movie, at least in places, feels aesthetically similar. This is why I'm fine with a chunk of T3, because at least in places, the Terminators feel like Terminators. I think they do a pretty good job, though there are parts that, due to it being the mid-2000s and it being a little bit, rushed, there are parts that aren't great, but at least it's, cool. Now, in terms of the movie itself, well, you may have seen it before. T3 is very much T2 again. Sarah Connor is dead. She has died of cancer off screen due to the fact that, Linda Hamilton didn't want to come back for it. I find this fine, right? It sucks that you had to kill a character off screen, but, what are you gonna do? You're gonna recast her, this iconic role? The series needed to now be more about John Connor, and even when I was younger, I understood why this movie was more about him and less about Sarah. This is better than something like, oh, I don't know, killing off Indiana Jones's son in between 4 and 5, you know? The parent making way for the child is a natural progression of a storyline. I don't like it, and I don't think the movie is better for it or that it was a great idea, and they really should have just held off in not having Linda Hamilton at all. But if you're gonna make a movie and you are going with it regardless of her or not, then it's fine. Mind you, it probably didn't even need to kill her, but having her not in the movie is really the thing I find perfectly fine, you know? This movie being about John and him in this world after his mom still being skittish on the fact that he still feels like eventually he's gonna be the John Connor that he has been told that he needs to be, is I think what makes his arc in this movie, at least to me, more acceptable. A way to continue his character in order for him to feel like he eventually has to be the man that he, when he was much younger, is told that he's going to be, is something that probably would mess someone up. The movie eventually kind of sees that he has this future wife, Kate Brewster, played by Claire Danes, who ultimately will kind of help ground him. And I feel like that's enough of an explanation for me on why he will eventually become the John Connor that we know he is. The actor picked in this is not the best possible. Nick Stahl is just kind of okay. He's actually a good actor. I've seen him like do way better stuff in other movies and TV shows, especially. Regardless, the movie is, you know, just what you've seen before. He sees the T-850 and then they run from the TX, who is sexy lady, big boobie. And they go through several repeated action scenes and chase scenes, right? They get chased to the mausoleum. They fight in the mausoleum. You're like, man, this story's boring, but at least there's a minigun. The movie ultimately deals with the prospect of the fact that they've only really delayed Judgment Day, and that Skynet's attack will occur on a particular day, which according to the earlier comics was 2004. Which is insane, by the way, that they ended up lining up very properly. Skynet is currently being worked on by who ends up actually being the father of Kate Brewster. Of course, you know, dumb military men doing military things, going, blah, 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 war, blah, blah, blah. They try to stop it. The TX activates these like older Terminators, which I actually really like the design of. And John has a big existential crisis when he finds out that the T-850 was sent by Kate because it had just killed John Connor. They end up having like no real reason to not use Skynet when apparently a computer virus ends up hacking a multitude of servers worldwide, which of course is really just thanks to the TX. So, you know, it ends up being sent out. They then go to what is supposedly Skynet's core and fight off the TX in the particle accelerator, which is a awesome fight scene, to be fully honest, where our boy the T-850 nearly reboots and kills John Connor. Thankfully, though, they're able to get out of there. He explodes himself, and the two find themselves in what is end up being not Skynet's core, but actually a fallout shelter, which of course the T-850 brought them to in order for them to survive. Skynet had no core, it has no baseline, it is a program, and it's now become sentient. In trying to stop the future, they have made it happen, and it is an ending that really messed with me as a kid. I thought it was a fantastic ending. This ending that you think they're gonna stop the bad guys has now resulted in them going, we are going to be in the future that we've tried to stop these several movies. And honestly, I still like it. I like endings that don't go with the easy answer, right? The happily ever ending thing would have been nice in the second movie. And the second movie should have stayed that way, obviously. But if you're going to continue it, this was the way to do it. Skynet being inevitable is a weird prospect, but I don't think it ruins the ending of the second movie. It doesn't do a good job continuing it, but it does continue in a place that I do feel is a natural continuation. If you're gonna have a sequel, it's gonna be more Terminator finding a way to make Skynet happen anyway. I think it was a big risk, and I think it actually works out. I think it's a nice little way to end your movie with a big oh fuck moment. It also almost says something. It's almost Harlan Ellison in a way. I mean, it's in no way close to Ham from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, but Skynet sort of has that similar feel to it, whether it means to or not. And I'm thinking way too hard into this ending, obviously. Way harder than the actual movie thought itself, more than likely. But that's sort of why I enjoy the idea of this ending and the idea of this movie. Because the movie itself isn't all that good. The movie itself isn't an awful film, and that's not coming from specifically nostalgia. I can get past nostalgia very easily. There's lots of movies from my childhood that I've rewatched and went, oh, that's shit. But, you know, this is part of that, kind of. Part of my enjoyment of this is also just the fact that it's still really cool. It still is a movie filled with a lot of, you know, big exploding action scenes, of which had a lot of effort going into making them look proper, and has a lot of guns, shooty, and explosions. That can be fun. And the fact that these effects don't look all that bad and still feel like Terminator, the movie can be fun at times. And part of it comes from partially ironic enjoyment. There are some scenes that are a little bit too goofy for its betterment. It's good this was made during the era where we're post 9/11, we're not taking things as much seriously, we're making fun of the yellow spandex era, right? We're in the mid 2000s, we're taking ourselves way too seriously and with lots of leather in one area, and then also making fun of how goofy things were back then in the 80s and 90s, even though we're just as goofy in our own stupid way. But looking back at it, it's fun. It's actually kind of a fun movie. Now, it isn't that great. Again, the acting is not all that good. It is increasingly generic. Arnold does a really great job, as does his opposite, TX, mostly because she says absolutely nothing. But they're fun. They're fun to see, but the actual main characters are just completely unlikable. This version of John Connor is annoying and just is not the John Connor that will eventually be the cool future guy, and you do not believe the relationship. As quick as the Kyle Reese one was in the first movie, there was any amount of like actual chemistry on screen. It just does not exist in T3. You don't even want to see these guys to get together. You specifically are like, get them off my screen. Yeah, sure, have them together off screen. Like, I don't like these two at all. And again, the film story itself is just, you know, T2 again, but not as interesting. And what really ultimately bogs this movie down is its editing. But the editing itself is what pisses me off in this movie. This was the mid 2000s and you could tell. This was the era right before Shaky Cam, but it was during the shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, shot 4, shot 1, shot 2, and it's just like, god damn it, settle on one shot. I hate that style of editing. It angers me. I hate seeing it in movies, in TV shows, in wrestling. I hate it. Settle on one shot. Settle on a moving shot. Settle on any shot, but the fucking 5, you're going one after another. It is so annoying, and T3 has that so much. It's what nearly ruins it for me. It settles down, especially later on in the movie, but that friggin' first chasing with the truck is unbearable. If you can settle down and deal with that, the movie can be fun, but it's really just fun in a baseline action film. To me, an action film needs to have two things to really be a good film: good action and good characters. And when you can't make me care about the characters, you better at least have good action. And T3 does enough of a job to at least be a watchable film. Its increasingly generic feel of its movie results in it being a major downturn for the franchise. It sure did well. Who didn't want to see friggin' another Terminator? But people really began to see, oh, huh, this figure never wants to like stay. It's like part of the like handle for the like minigun like fell off. And this big bag, I forget what's in it. I think just bullets. Yeah, bullets are coming out of it. It just like, it never wants to stay on him. P.S. This man became the governor after this movie. I think because of this movie, actually. So that's at least one thing. So now we get to a little bit of a like change in terms of the franchise. Several T3 comics were made, some by Beckett Comics, one by Dynamite Comics, which attempted to kind of have like a different version of a T3 type thing, kind of like continuing more off of the events of T2. And Atari made 3 whole separate games. I think I've read that it was supposed to be a game in 3 parts, but really it's 3 separate developers made a T3 game, one after another, after one decided to not continue. In the middle of that, though, in 2008, there was the Sarah Connor Chronicles. I'm not going to do a big thing on that, but let's just say it's a pretty fun, weird mid-2000s show. You get Cameron, who was this another Terminator from the future, which John, now played by Thomas Dekker, certainly doesn't want to kiss. And then bang! Warner Brothers did help make Sarah Connor Chronicles, which is why I mentioned them, alongside C2 Pictures, but then the Halcyon Company ultimately took over development, making the last much longer season, which feels entirely different than the first one. The first season in 2007 was supposed to be a 13-episode season, but an actual writer's strike did mess with that. But a much longer second season was then made and ended on a cliffhanger due to the fact that the Halcon company wasn't really interested. Banja and Kassar ultimately tried to make another film. Production was started in 2005, and Arnold was even going to return, though in a limited form because, again, he was the governor. And they did try to have Warner Brothers help them, thus the reason why they were involved in the TV show, but that didn't happen. The production rights were sold to the Halcyon company due to the fact that their business was currently going out. The guys who started a business and then it went out of business for them to buy the stuff from their old business, his new business then went out of business. Thus, a whole other company ultimately decided to buy their stuff from a hedge fund. MGM, which had exclusive distribution rights to whatever future movie would come, also tried to just buy the Terminator films outright, but they were unable to. But they would be given a 30-day right of first refusal to finance and distribute a fifth Terminator film in the future. This would actively continue in the future when the Halcyon company would own the rights, but that's, spoilers for later. They decided that John Connor would be a secondary character, a little bit like some kind of Jesus figure who would help guide the real main character, who even in the early parts was to be a cyborg named Marcus. Marcus being a cyborg isn't a new idea for the franchise. Early Dark Horse comics actually had cyborg characters, but it's very new for the movies. And hell is kept as a big secret all the way up until the midpoint of it, unless you were, watching the previews of it or any bits on it on FX in which you knew going into it. So, oopsie. The first full screenplay was written by the Terminator 3 writers, but ultimately Paul Haggis rewrote the script and later Sean Ryan rewrote it later on, 3 weeks before filming. Its director was chosen to be Joseph McGinty Nicol, also known as MCG, who was known for doing the mid-2000s Charlie's Angels films and We Are Marshall. Not a bad idea to pick him, and ultimately his direction I think works pretty well. The cinematography of Terminator 4 works pretty well. It's one of the only parts of the films I don't have a problem with. It's shot more like a war film, it's cringy and dirty feeling, and it has a very different feel than other parts of Terminators, but it does a good job at trying to replicate, at least in some way, how the, future skeleton robot war is supposed to look. It did a pretty good job trying to do late 2000s versions of shots of the future that were seen in earlier movies. And the Terminators certainly do feel like they move like the Terminators in the older films. When you really look at John Connor, future John Connor, yeah, that kind of makes sense. It just sucks that he isn't the main character, because instead the main character again is Marcus, played by Sam Worthington. Sam Worthington, who is a good actor, ends up really just not hitting it in this movie, at all. Probably just due to the fact that the movie just feels so lost. Multiple rewrites even during filming. And this one was also affected by the same writer strike, which, affected the show going on during the time. Plus, the filming was rushed due to the fact that the Screen Actors Guild strike would be very soon after. The movie just has a very different kind of vibe to it, and it sometimes works. There's the occasional action scene that can be fun. The big-ass Terminator that shows up out of nowhere and sends little motorcycle Terminators is kind of a fun scene, but then you go to any dialogue scene and you are bored as piss. And that's the unfortunate reason why Salvation ends up being kind of as bad of a film as 3. There are parts that work, and there are parts that don't. It's a kind of nice-looking film. At least I think so. At least, in the purposefully dingy, dirty, gritty way, obviously. And it didn't hit me at first, but years later, I like its vibe. And I like how the Terminators look. They look awesome. They look cool as shit, dude. Look at them. And as dumb as the CGI Arnold looks, it's kind of a fun fight. He gets wrecked by the guy. They do not even try to fight that thing. They're like, get out of here. And he feels appropriately absolutely terrifying. The problem is Skynet. Skynet tries to convince Marcus and that's the reason why he's a cyborg. They almost try to do kind of what Skynet did in the Dark Horse comics of turning people into cyborgs to try and have them infiltrate things. It really worked better as they were servants being forced by Skynet to work for it. It felt more like this horrifying monster that hated humans instead of this really stupid robot computer that's oh, I gotta deal with this shit again. There should have been so much more of John Connor, and even though it is cool that he gets the scar and a robot heart or something Salvation ends up being barely a plot. In the future year of 2018, the Resistance is in LA and they're going to a submarine and they're kind of just like chilling out there for a bit. They're gonna try to attack Skynet's headquarters because I guess it does have a core somewhere, but they can't quite get there because apparently there is a kill list that Skynet is having. Weird that it has a kill list of particular people and that, weirdly enough, Kyle Reese is on it. Marcus, who at first is very uninterested in trying to help, is convinced to go be the guy to go help Kyle Reese very quickly soon after saying, "No, go away." After fighting some cool-looking Terminators, he nearly dies and is found to be a cyborg. They're like, should we get rid of him? But then they don't. They decide to use him in order for them to go on this offensive against Skynet, which unfortunately they soon figure out that Skynet already knows about it, because of course it does. But using the cyborgness of Marcus, they're able to try and get rid of the perimeter defenses and at least get something in this offense against Skynet. Which, P.S., Skynet already knew that was going to happen and already noped out of there, so really the whole offensive was pointless. John is injured by this, but Marcus's heart is given to him, so Marcus will always be a part of him. Terminator Salvation is a movie that is just kind of boring. It was really cool in its first half, but ends up being increasingly generic by the end. It is a movie that I just cannot recommend. Its idea is cool. Being in the future is such a new idea and could have worked, but it just doesn't. You almost want to like this movie because it almost begins pretty well and feels like the right step in the franchise, but it just isn't. Salvation isn't that bad of a film, but it is incredibly boring and disappointing. It could have been so much better, and it just doesn't try. It's clear that they were really just stretched down to time, and that alongside the wrong people behind it, very clearly, and a multitude of rewrites, it now becomes this aimless movie that probably wasn't very fun to make. You already know about the set freakout. I'm not gonna talk about the set freakout. Here's a clip. This was supposed to be the first in a new Terminator trilogy. Probably like, the 4, 5, and 6 of like a hexology could have been interesting. Where it would have went, I don't care. Halcyon followed for bankruptcy soon afterwards, and though some of the people who were making it did end up finishing and sending out films all the way till 2011, a lot of the stuff that they owned, mostly Terminator, was acquired by Pacifor, the very leasing company Halcyon had bought their stuff from initially. And though they as a company did technically continue to exist all the way till 2013, it would be then that they would cease to exist. Several things were during this time, of course. IDW did have a couple comics that tied into it. Dark Horse did continue to keep making stuff, and some of them are kind of alright. And Halcyon's own game company even made a Salvation game. But really, when you think about Salvation, you think of that awesome arcade game that's still in arcades with the awesome gray gun. You know what I'm talking about. And definitely not the Machinima-made series that uses the game itself to make this boring-ass narrative, which is mostly just John Connor's wife, whose name I've already forgotten, talking about things for a long time. Ugh. Sequel ideas went back and forth all over the place. Universal tried to maybe make one, with it maybe being about Arnold coming back, and it was gonna have Justin Lin, who was previously working on Fast and Furious, as being the director, and Chris Morgan was gonna help write it. Terminator Tokyo Drift would have been probably very fun, and better than what we ended up actually getting. Megan Ellison and her production company, Annapurna Pictures, are the people that ended up picking up the rights to the Terminator in 2011. The deal finalized in 2012 dealt in such a way that now resulted in new copyright laws shifting stuff that if they didn't make a movie in a certain number of years, the rights would go back to James Cameron in 2019. Ellison's brother David, who owned Skydance Productions, agreed to co-produce the new film, which they would begin in 2011, which would hopefully start a new trilogy of films. Wait, start a new trilogy of films? Why does that sound so familiar? Calling it Terminator Genysis, the movie would come out in 2015, with its sequel slated for release in 2017 and 2018. They had a lot riding on this, and that's the reason they decided to bring, our good boy Arnold right back now that he was no longer the Governator, and decided to go back to the roots of this series. No longer would Justin Lin be part of it anymore, because he just really couldn't be, so they brought in Alan Taylor. the writers decided to get together and make a sort of multiversal idea of, nah, we can change the timeline. Thus, they introduced the T-5000, which is essentially Skynet in a human body who ultimately then infects people with itself. We'll get to that in a minute. But it interrupts the process of Kyle Reese being sent back in time as we initially saw it in the original movie. Kyle Reese now being played by a guy who looked nothing like Kyle Reese. Played by Jai Courtney, who did try to slim down for this role, but is just not the right pick for Kyle Reese, is sent back in time exactly when he was, but it seems the timeline that he goes to is shifted. Now, okay, besides some slight changes due to the fact that the future still happens, but it happens in a slightly different way, the timeline is still pretty secular, you know? There was the initial future, and you go back to change it to a slightly different future, you know? It's a little bit of like a ripple, you know? You have a new branching timeline. Look at how it looks, you know, in Back to the Future. You have a slightly different branch that isn't too far, but has changed. The future is different from what it was in the initial Terminator. God knows you can shove all the comics wherever you want, but then you get the T2 future, which is approximately the same future as the T3 future. But due to the slight changes in the events of T3, you now have the Salvation future, where, you know, it happens even sooner. The actual events of what happens are now shifted, as it seems that, at least I'm putting this in my brain because this is not explained in the movies themselves, but the Skynet from 4, who was essentially done with everything, was like, I'm just gonna make a robot, stand even further back, but so far back to the whole Kyle Reese thing, that it essentially stops all of the other movies from ever happening. My belief is that it sends the T-5000 to the original future like a multiversal like change and tells itself to be like, don't send the T-1000 to when John Connor's young, send it to when Sarah Connor's a baby, and I'm gonna send John Connor into the future. He'll continue to exist, but he'll be me. Unfortunately, presumably, John Connor, but in the Salvation timeline, sends Pops, who is another T-800, into the past and stops the T-1000 from ever messing with things. He raises Sarah Connor, who is now played by an actress who does an alright job being Sarah Connor, I guess. And she's way more prepared than Kyle Reese thought she was gonna be. Arnold even kicks his own ass, and I'd like to imagine it's them pointing at the, like, CG version of him from Salvation, even though he is played by an actual man who's like his body double, who will weirdly be his body double in the next Terminator film. Isn't that strange? They try their best to make these movies look very similar, and aesthetically they look approximately similar, at least in terms of the time frames in the early parts of the movie that take place in the 80s. They do a good job replicating those scenes, yeah. And the parts in the future do a good job looking like the future that we saw in T2. I think those look pretty cool, not gonna lie. But let's be honest here, all of this really doesn't work properly when it comes to the rest of the movie, for 3 reasons. One of the reasons is the cast. The cast is fine, but it could have been better. I don't want to shit too much on Jason Clarke, but I think he's the best actor in all of these movies. I'm gonna tell you right now, John Connor is the bad guy of the movie, but he actually studied Furlong and does try his best to try and replicate how that character acted, at least when he's pretending to be a good guy. He does feel more like a older John Connor than previous, but he, alongside the actors for Reese and Sarah, should have been who they initially wanted it to be. It should have been Garrett Hedlund, Tom Hardy, and Brie Larson. That is the cast that I would have picked to be a modern version of these characters. Hell, one of their other choices, Boyd Holbrook, would have been a better choice. Jai Courtney was not the right choice to be Kyle Reese. Bro does not look like Kyle Reese, nor does he act like Kyle Reese, nor does anyone act like anyone in this movie. Terminator Genysis oozes this mid-2010s feel that has ultimately, unfortunately, come from the success of the MCU. Various films now have this very unrealistic feeling style for their action scenes to try and feel more superhero-y and over the top, and this unfortunately makes the CGI and action parts in the movies feel just not really all that well working. None of it has a lot of gravity to it or weight to it, and none of it just really fits all that well. There are good parts to it. There are lots of shooty explosions, and I think the fight against the T-3000, don't ask me how the 5000 made the 3000, who is the 4000? Is it his hand? whatever. But the fight against evil John Connor, I think, is fun. Honestly, people shit on the design. I think he looks kind of cool. Maybe a little bit creepy, to be honest. Weird, like, metal muscle man? Looks pretty cool. You know who else is from the future? Now, after, of course, coming to the future and seeing the fact that Sarah Connor is way more ready for him than they initially thought, they fight off the T-1000, now played by someone else entirely. I guess they couldn't get Robert Patrick. What was he doing at the time? Oh, nothing. They then teleport into 2017, 2 years after when the movie was made, weird, where they find themselves to seeing older John Connor, who was born regardless of them, and they're confused at this, but as you already know, he is in fact the John Connor from the future, who's been affected by Skynet, and he is now the T-3000, and he is making Genysis, spelled with a Y, because, ooh, evil Steve Jobs is now your main villain as he essentially tries to send it everywhere in the world, almost kind of similar to what happened later on, and that maybe the intention is to get Genysis in everyone's systems in order to actually make Skynet be a thing? Who knows? But basically, it's Skynet, a different Skynet that is for the modern iPod age. It will infect everyone's iPod with U2s in the name of love. Ultimately, they try to escape. They then go to the core of where, Skynet, Genysis is. It's a big old spinny machine, but old man Terminator fights weird John Connor cyborg. And with help of parts of the T-1000, he's actually able to defeat John Connor. The Terminator finally kills John Connor. That's weird. There is a little scene which, shows that they meet young Kyle Reese, which is like a sort of thing they try to build in the movie, which really means nothing. And obviously post-credit scene, John Connor, he's alive. And supposedly the sequel would have been about John Connor fighting for control of himself, which is why I honestly find him being evil fine. I actually like the idea of evil John Connor. It's got that, we're not supposed to like that he's evil, It's got that actually good idea of a twist, We want John Connor to be the good guy, so we're like, no. But, what makes it, I think, fine and not a bad idea is it does attempt, doesn't do a good job at doing it, but it does attempt at adding something to the point of the movie. It tries to be a new part of this lore of John Connor now needs to fight against Skynet in a way we never knew possible. Had there been a sequel and had this one did a better job at establishing him as a villain and more than generic evil bad guy, there could have been something there. It's again what I kind of liked about T3, the idea of it. The idea of evil John Connor could have been good. A character arc from this one to the third one could have been interesting, but it isn't. With the fact of how badly acted this is, from how badly shot it is, from how the fact that they focus so much on the special effects, 8,000 special effects shot for it to end up being a big blob of CGI of a bunch of random explosions that end up having no gravity or weight to them. No real stakes are in this movie. It feels like these guys get away with way too much. And pointless laughs which add absolutely nothing to the film for no reason, with awful pacing and a way too complicated attempt at its time travel, result in a movie that ends up just taking what was previously established and fucking with it because they feel like it would be a good idea. They make it a way more complicated movie than it ends up being, and it just blows my mind into trying to understand how the time travel works. Somehow, time travel, when it's already happened, can be affected. If you go further back in time, you can affect the timeline in that guy will still come to, even if the time that he's come from no longer exists, because you have already shifted it by going further back in time. What? Point is, none of this makes any sense, and you're not supposed to care, and nor should you. Genysis is a mess of a movie, and I hate it. It sure did well enough than you would have expected, but still, somehow it wasn't enough for the people making the movie. But despite all the attempts at getting all these YouTubers, all of which have been canceled at this point, to try and promote their movie, it seems that it just didn't do well enough for them. And eventually, though I still think partially owned by Skydance, most of the rights did eventually go back to James Cameron. It took him a minute, but eventually Cameron and Skydance would eventually convince Tim Miller, after just finishing Deadpool 2, to go and make a new Terminator film. James Cameron, who was too busy making Avatar 2, was essentially barely part of the production of the film, and really, it was Skydance. Whether it be interference or Tim Miller's lack of an idea of what this franchise should be, Dark Fate ended up being a third time of the same thing happening again. Dark Fate came out 2019 with the prospect of being another trilogy of films. A whole different idea of where the timeline will go, ignoring everything before, especially Genysis, and starting right after Terminator 2. A great prospect, and one that brought a lot of people in. Even friggin' Sarah Connor herself, who came back for this movie. We didn't think it was possible. And despite the awful picture that they showed us to promote the movie, it was certainly interesting. It had to be good. It had to be good. This movie essentially bombed at the box office. And I wonder why. Dark Fate somehow is an even worse movie than Genysis. And for a little bit, when it came out, I was like, well, it's not that bad. It's at least as bad as the third Terminator, because it is literally verbatim T3 again. But no, it's worse. Made by a team of writers with a little bit of input from James Cameron himself, the movie ultimately is a sequel to T2, the true 3, something he said 2 times before, but James Cameron is here to help make, quote-unquote, a new third Terminator film. Skynet is gone. Skynet is not a thing in this movie, but the movie essentially does exactly what T3 did and essentially goes, Skynet is inevitable. Supposedly, there's a new thing in the future, and it has sent Rev 9, its new Terminator, who honestly looks kinda cool. I like the weird, double Terminator thing. I think it's a cool idea, not gonna lie. Is sent to fight Danny Ramos, who in the future is essentially the new John Connor. She has sent a cyborg, Grace, who, mind you, people initially were like, it's a ripoff of Marcus, but again, cyborgs have been a thing since Dark Horse, so not really. She's sent from the future in order to stop Rev 9, and eventually get help from Arnold himself, who is just sort of out there and super old in now a different but vaguely similar way to the stupid explanation that was given in the previous one. Who else do they get help from? Sarah Connor. Sarah Connor, who's essentially been hunting down Terminators for this long because she's been getting, leaks from someone in order to fight against a multitude of Terminators who were sent every couple of years in order to still try and get John Connor. It's like Skynet was like, oh, I fucked up, send, and she's been killing them multiple times. Inevitably, she finds out that this is because of the T-800, who's settled down and has had a family, not blood related, but still, and he's felt bad for his actions. It's not the same T-800 from T2, it's one of the ones that was sent to kill John Connor in the send. But instead of being happy that she'll get help from Carl, because, he just helped her, right? But no, she's not. In fact, there's a good reason why I hate this movie. It's the reason why Sarah Connor, played by the out-of-practice Linda Hamilton, is such an absolute bitch in this movie. It's weird to say that. I don't think a woman in a movie should easily just be called bitchy simply because she's not ready to work with a person that she doesn't like, right? A character should have their own reasons for it and should have character growth, but even all the way up until the ending, she hates this guy. She is given no reason to like this guy, even though she does have a reason. A Terminator did help her in the past, but one also killed John Connor. The movie opens up with John Connor being shot down by another T-800, and it's just, that's it. That's how they follow up. It was Cameron's idea, quoting, let's just get right off the table. Let's pull the carpet from underneath all of our assumptions on what a Terminator is gonna be about. Tim Miller saying, you can't have John be a 36-year-old accountant somewhere, when no, that's what I want. Evil John Connor was an interesting prospect, and they didn't do it well, but it wasn't an insult to what the fucking ending of T2 was. By that point, we had already established that, the future was already gonna happen. Here it is, right? Genysis was so weird and flip-floppy that it wasn't the same John Connor. Whatever. And again, with a better arc, the idea could have worked. And plus, at least John Connor was alive! Killing off John Connor is such a shitty idea. My God, how to immediately piss off a whole audience to want a fucking refund. I bet this was bought a lot more and got immediate refunds. Killing Sarah Connor off in between films at least could have been something. It could have been a way to build off the character. And again, though he didn't do it well in T3, at least the idea makes sense. Even when I was young, I understood that eventually John Connor was gonna be on his own. He wasn't gonna be with his mommy throughout the fucking Skeleton War. So of course to me, it made sense to get rid of her eventually. If I was to write T3, she would have died in that movie, and it would have been a good send-off, a good passing of the torch moment. Because Sarah Connor dying made sense, because John Connor needs to be the guy to fight for the future. That was his arc. That's why I felt T3 was fine, at least acceptable as a concept. That's why I felt Salvation made sense to exist, and why it's at least watchable. That's why Genysis is a better movie, because it understood that you need John Connor in your fucking Terminator film, because this is what the series is about. You want a spin-off without him? Cool. You want to have a movie focused not on him, but at least has him? Fine. You don't kill young John Connor, who looks still the way he did in T2, who is still the same character. You don't just kill him off barely soon after the events of T2. That's insulting. I want to see John Connor not living that life. If you're gonna have a new main character, you did not need to kill John Connor. If John Connor in this new better future was a regular dude, I would have loved that. You know how much I like to see when the characters in action films have retired and are living normal lives? You know how rewarding that is? They went through all this shit. They deserve to settle down. That's why enough sequels eventually ruins that, you know? They did that they can stop all this fighting and killing and finally settle down is a great prospect, man. The fact that there's finally somewhere to stop all this is somewhere where you have to get eventually, because you can't keep doing it forever. So to kill off a character because you're like, we don't want to see John Connor be a loser. No, man. And I'm sorry, for whatever reason, the T-800 is sad about this. Why? They explain it. It's stupid. Why? He's aging. They explain it, but it's stupid. There's a new Skynet, which is even worse than Skynet being inevitable, because at least there was a reason given why Skynet was still made anyway. It's a weird one, but it worked. Skynet was still being developed by other people. It was still Skynet, but there being a whole separate evil computer virus made by other people is somehow even more stupid as the Skynet is inevitable thing. And yeah, chase scenes ensues. They get fight by technically one Terminator. The T-800 barely does anything. The action's utter garbage, looks like shit, shot like shit. I like the Rev 9's design, but the CGI used to portray him just feels not all together, like it was unfinished. And God knows when they go all superhero-y, it just bumps it down so hard. If the pacing doesn't piss you off, as it did me, then the absolute state of the action scenes will. It's like I said, if I don't care about the characters, I better care about your action scenes. And when I don't, you have failed me. You have failed me in actively trying to care about your action films. When your characters are jumping around, when they're normal people who are acting like superheroes, and they're fucking Linda Hamilton barely giving a shit, then it just pisses me right off. Genysis took what was previously established and just threw it out and went, we'll make something new. But this one threw all the fuck out, shit on it, and said, fuck you. And that's why I hate this movie. Because the basic idea of it, you take Linda out, you take Arnold out, would have been a boring-ass movie that still wouldn't have been shot well, still wouldn't have been well acted, but at least would have been a generic enough Terminator sequel that I would have at least said was as bad as the third movie, because at least there's some ironic enjoyment there could be from the stupid ass lines in this movie that continues to exude this late 2010s feel of, that was weird, wasn't it? And yeah, if it was just that, I'd say still a bad film, but at least it's ironically bad. But then you take what was already in the series and you just take the biggest, hardest, wettest donkey shit all over what I so much enjoy. That's why Dark Fate is fucking awful. I don't get mad at movies too often, but you already know how much I absolutely love the first two Terminator films. They are absolute, just art to me. I love them. So to take what was there by the people who should know better and just to make this absolute garbage fire of a movie. Insults me to my very core. They were so proud of this movie, they were shitting all over the other ones. They were making a whole game and a comic series. There were plans for sequels, and that sure didn't happen for the third whole time, technically fourth whole time, that a movie did not get its sequels because it failed. At least this time, a company didn't go out of business. Now James Cameron still owns the rights to the series, I'm pretty sure. I'm unclear how much Skydance owns of the series, but at the very least, Cameron owns it. With a 2024 comic series and Terminator Zero, an animated series which looks neat, at least, coming out, the Terminator franchise certainly isn't done, but I kind of put this movie in a similar vein of Aliens 3, right? Or it's Alien 3. Aliens is such a really great movie with this hopeful conclusion, and when you bring in the sequel and you kill off the characters and you have this insulting piece of shit movie, whole other discussion, by the way, I will eventually have. But unlike that, there's an idea of where you could go. Aliens isn't just about Ripley. Sequels with Aliens had Ripley, sure, but when they went elsewhere, they figured out that they could have more, and they totally should. And with the new series, it shows you that they can, in fact, make other things that are Alien. There have been way more not Ripley involved Aliens media, whether it be video games or comic books or other sequels that cross over to other things. You don't need Ripley for Alien. This is the reason I want to see more Alien stuff, right? There is a potential for a future in that series. But for Terminator, no. You can't do Terminator without the Connors. They're the whole point of the series. You maybe could try, but from how sour the experience of these movies have left us, I don't want to see Terminator. I love Terminator more than I love the Aliens movies. I don't want to see a new Terminator. You've ruined the potential of making a genuine sequel, but at least left it open for another movie to then ruin the potential of making a cool future war thing, and then you ruin the prospect of ever trying to make up for that by making Genysis. And then you ruin the idea of this franchise ever recovering from any of that by making the, quote, true sequel be the worst movie in the series. There will be a Terminator sequel. Just like Skynet, Terminator is inevitable. We will see it. It's now been several years. I expect they're going to announce a new Terminator sequel in like 2026 or 7. As I was when Dark Fate came out, I am very precarious with another sequel, right? After seeing those initial 3, Dark Fate, I was like, please be good. But I knew going into it that it might not, and even still, it pissed me off. And it's this feeling that I'm left with towards the ending of this franchise. This is what has happened. This constant attempt of bringing it back by new people and utter failure multiple times is what the Terminator franchise is. And it's to the point that people don't want to see the Terminator. They've fully and utterly wrung out all good faith in this franchise ever again. You're probably not going to see Arnold in the next one. He's just kind of getting to the point where it's just not possible anymore. You sure as shit aren't going to see Linda Hamilton. I think I'm fine with that, considering apparently she was awful to work with on set. And I don't know if you're going to see any characters from friggin' Dark Fate in any capacity, or any of the sequels, to be honest. There will be another reboot in some way. God knows next time it'll be a full, complete reboot, and maybe that's what the series needs. If any series needs a reboot, it's the Terminator. But despite all of that, the Terminator franchise is left wide open. The idea of it continuing, we'll see. But even despite all that, I still enjoy the first 2. The sequels, when they introduce new concepts, end up affecting how the originals are and my enjoyment of them. And that's mostly a me thing, but other people have that same idea. And that's why it's hard for me to go back to, Aliens, for instance, because I know Alien 3 is still... it still exists, right? It's not a separate timeline that I can ignore, like Terminator 3. When it comes to Terminator 3, I can just fully ignore it and Salvation, Genysis, and especially Dark Fate. I can absolutely enjoy the first 2 Terminator films because I can pretend that they had that nice little happy ending with the swing set, you know? That's perfectly fine for me. I can live with that, and these films will always go down as some of my favorites, despite everything that happened afterwards Terminator 1 and Terminator 2 are still some of the greatest films of all time, and they will be remembered as such. And if you haven't already went and seen them, go ahead and watch them. Maybe T3 for some fun, and maybe Salvation just cause, you know, I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with that, but nothing past that, and probably nothing else, really. Most of the games kind of blow, and a lot of the comics are just kind of, you know, you saw the comic art. But Terminator, regardless, will go as a franchise that, despite as broken as it can really be, it is one that I feel like altogether has brought me a lot of enjoyment for what is good. And it's one that I will, for the most part, remember fondly. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and subscribe, leave a like, and make sure you leave as many comments as possible to tell me to watch RoboCop or whatever else I should watch. I got, you know, please give me ideas. I never know what to do, ever. But most importantly, stay good, stay safe, and don't be an asshole.